Hello. So this is a little tutorial about splines inside Notch, and specifically how to use 3D shapes to drive spline creation rather than importing curves or using nulls to manually define splines. And I'll just start playback of this little example that I was messing around with and posted on Instagram the other day. So basically what we're looking at is a sphere that's flying around in the scene and leaving a trail of nulls behind it, and those nulls create a spline. That's basically all this. I'll just go down here to this shape 3D and set visibility to 1. And I'll just turn up the emissiveness a little bit. So that's the white sphere flying around there, kind of just generating the spline. On top of that, there's a bunch of post effects. So if I just turn all those off, you can see it a little bit more clearly, perhaps. Right. I'm just gonna create a new scene and go through the kind of the setup of how to do something like this. So first off, perhaps just to kind of show the way that I was using, or the way that I was creating splines before, would have been to take a number of nulls and pipe them into a spline node, move the nulls around, and that would give you the spline, and you could then modify those in various ways, but it wasn't really something that I was getting much use out of, to be honest. So rather, the idea that someone on, I think his name was Alexander, on the Facebook Notch forum mentioned that you can use this node called node trail. And what it does is it takes an input, for example, a shape 3D. I'll just root that so we can see it. Or actually need a light before we can see anything. So if I animate this shape 3D, for example, in the X dimension, in the X position, this will now move back and forth, and where it has been, it's going to leave a null or a trail, and that's this trail of nodes. And this trail of nodes you can then pipe into, for example, an extruded spline, and that'll give you an extruded spline. I'll just disable that. Obviously this is quite boring, so I'll just create a couple of other math modifiers to animate in the Y and in the Z position also. Also change up these values a little bit, because otherwise it's going to be very boring. And now if I restart play ahead, this should give us a little bit more of a bit more interesting curve. This will eventually, though, end up just being, like you see here, a repeating shape, and that's kind of well, it might not be what you want. So what you can do instead is take a combiner node. In this case, I'm going to pipe this math modifier into the first input. It just takes two values, and then you can, using the combiner node, you can add them together or multiply them or do whatever you want. I'll pipe this into the X position. I'll then take another math modifier, pipe that into the value 2, and set this to something random, for example, interpolated noise. And this the value coming out of this combiner node is now going to be more random and much more interesting. So if I just restart the playhead, the repeating shape that we had before is not going to be repeating anymore. And you can then I'm not going to do that right now, but you could repeat the same process with the combiner node for the Y and the Z math modifiers. Okay, I'll just go back to this extruded spline, turn that back on again, disable the show spline on the node trail node, and now we're going to have this this sphere flying around in space, showing or dragging an extruded spline behind it. I'll just turn off the visibility of the sphere. Okay, so that was kind of part one of the example that I started showing, or that I showed at the start of the video. You can kind of elaborate a little bit on this by creating another extruded spline. So in this case, there are two extruded splines running on top of each other, and obviously you can't see that, but they have parameters they can change. Like for example, the visible age, you set that to 1. So now you have the thicker spline up here, and the thinner spline running a longer span of the spline. You can also play around with these parameters that kind of change how much of a lead-in the spline has at the beginning and the end of the extrusion. Right. I'll just pipe. Actually, let me do something else. I'll just add a floor. So shape 3D, add that. Turn it into plane. I'll just scale that up 50. See how skylight is throwing a lot of shadows. I'll just add another light, or add a normal light. Shift dragging on the gizmos constrains them. When you rotate, at least, constrains them to 15 degree, or no, 30 degree increments. I'll just enable cast shadows, and I might disable the skylight. So now we have this snake kind of thing, and maybe I'll make it a bit more detailed. Right, the emissive material, I'll just pipe that into the materials slot on each of these extruded spline nodes. So this is emissive now. Add a little bit of glow. 0.5. And maybe give this light a little bit of a color also. Could give this a color also, make it a little bit more interesting. Right. Something else you can do is to create baked animations, and then use that animation to drive the spline. Like in this case, I've drawn this little spiral thing, taken this cube and just constrained it along the motion path, just like this, and this gives a little this little animation. If I select this, do export selection, test animation, and remember to tick bake animation. That should give us an FBX file that can be imported now. And this can also be used to drive a node trail. So if I create another node trail and pipe this polycube that was baked or had animation baked on it, this should now emit a node trail also. Let's see, maybe I need to parent it or to root it. And this will then loop to the beginning of the animation. I'm not exactly sure how to avoid that yet, so I'll have to learn a little bit more about that. But basically those are two ways of coming up with something that's a little bit more useful with regards to splines, I think. And then if I wanted to add a little bit of post effects and recreate some of the visual styling that I had on the other scene, I believe I had some screen warp, not that much. Also had some chromatic amount that was set a little bit higher, and then I had some an orbit cam and a couple of other cameras that were moving around the scene. But basically this is what I want to show. I hope it has been useful. Leave me a comment if you thought it was useful, and yeah, maybe see you next time.